In the year 793 AD, the absolute most secure place in the Western world, it had no walls. It
Right.
had no watchtowers, no armed guards at all. And yet, the people who lived there felt, safer than a modern billionaire in a reinforced bunker.
Oh, absolutely.
Because their security wasn't based on stone or steel, it was based on an idea. It
Yeah.
was this universally shared, totally unquestionable rule across the entirety of Christian Europe.
Yeah. The ultimate taboo.
Exactly. You do not attack a house of God. Full
Yeah.
stop. But, that begs the question, what happens when people suddenly arrive on your shores who simply don't share your rules?
Or who don't even know your rules exist in the first place.
Right.
I mean, what you get is a collision that literally shatters a civilization.
Yeah.
You get the violent end of one era and the birth of a terrifying new one.
So I want to take you to a very specific place. Picture this. It's early summer, June 8th, 793, and you're standing on this small, windswept island right off the northeast coast of England.
Lindisfarne.
Lindisfarne. They call it the Holy Island. And it's connected to the mainland by this tidal causeway, which means that twice a day, the ocean just completely swallows the road.
It physically cuts the island off from the rest of humanity.
Yeah, exactly. And in that total isolation, for 150 years, a community of monks has lived in absolute uninterrupted peace.
A century and a half of just quiet devotion.
Right. They spend their days copying illuminated manuscripts, praying, walking the shingle beaches. I mean, there is no threat. There is no fear.
It's an environment of profound security. And it's crucial to understand that they weren't being naive.
Right, right.
In their world, in the 8th century, they were as safe as anyone could possibly be, because the sanctity of the monastery was a very real, very functional shield against all the kings and armies of Europe.
Yeah, because even the most ruthless warlord in England wouldn't dare incur the wrath of God by raiding a church. It just wasn't done.
Never.
So there they are, completely unsuspecting. And then over the sound of the wind, there is this new noise.
A terrible noise.
This harsh, grating sound of heavy wooden keels scraping violently against the beach. These strange ships have just appeared out of literally nowhere.
Long, sleek vessels.
Yeah, shallow vessels with prows carved into these terrifying, snarling shapes of dragons. And before the monks can even process what they are looking at, men are just pouring out onto the sand.
Heavily armed men, warriors, who have crossed the violent North Sea and who have absolutely zero fear of the Christian God.
Right. And they aren't there to negotiate. They aren't there to conquer territory.
No, they're there for the gold, sitting totally unguarded on the altars.
And what happens next is sudden, it's brutal, and it's horrifying. We are talking about a massacre. Unarmed monks cut down exactly where they stand, their blood just pooling on the stone floors of the sanctuary.
And others drowned in the sea.
Yeah. The survivors are dragged off in chains to be sold in foreign slave markets. The raiders tear the gold and silver off the holy shrines, load up their dragon ships, and just vanish back into the ocean.
Leaving the spiritual heart of Britain bloodied and completely broken. I mean, it was an event of unfathomable trauma.
Completely.
A profound rupture, not just for the victims on that beach, but for the entire world they belonged to. It was this massive wake-up call that the rules of reality had just changed.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to this deep dive. We are taking a fascinating stack of historical records, letters, and chronicles, and we are zeroing in on this single terrifying day.
Because Lindisfarne wasn't just a robbery.
No, not at all. The shockwave of this single morning was so massive that historians use this exact date, June 8th, 793 AD, as the definitive starting pistol for the Viking Age.
It changed everything.
We are going to explore the buildup, the brutal, terrifying logic behind the attack, the deep mechanisms of why it happened exactly when it did, and how this collision changed history forever. But first, I have a very basic question.
Okay, lay it on me.
I need to play devil's advocate for a second. Was Lindisfarne literally the very first time a Norseman set foot in Britain and caused trouble?
It's a great question, and, well, no. Strictly speaking, it wasn't. History is always messier than the neat lines we draw centuries later.
Right, there are always blurrier edges.
Exactly. There were hints, there were warning signs. For example, the historical records show an incident a few years prior at a place called Portland, down on the southern coast of England.
Okay, what happened there?
So, 3 strange ships pulled into the harbor, and a royal official, a reeve, basically rowed out to meet them, assuming they were just merchants.
Makes sense.
Right, so he tried to direct them to the royal estate to, pay their trading taxes.
Yeah.
And they just killed him on the spot.
Wow. just murdered a government official. So violent contact had already happened. Why don't we call the Portland incident the start of the Viking Age? Why does Lindisfarne get all the historical spotlight?
Because of the symbolic weight. I mean, Portland was a skirmish. It was a localized tragedy, a misunderstanding that turned lethal. But Lindisfarne was something entirely different. Well, you have to step into the shoes of an 8th century European to understand what Lindisfarne was. This wasn't just a stone building with some guys in robes.
Right.
This was the spiritual epicenter of the Christian North. It was founded by St. Aidan. It housed the shrine of St. Cuthbert, who was arguably the most venerated holy figure of the time.
People traveled from all over, right?
Exactly. Pilgrims traveled massive distances just to pray near his body.
Because in the medieval economy, the bones of a saint weren't just spooky relics. They were an economic engine, right? They drew people, they drew massive donations, they drew royal patronage.
They did. They completely believed the spiritual power of the saint was literally physically present in those bones. And Lindisfarne was also the birthplace of the Lindisfarne Gospels, which we'll get into later. But they were absolute masterpieces of human creation.
Striking there was a huge deal.
Huge. When the Norsemen struck Lindisfarne, they weren't just hitting a regional bank. They were driving a dagger into the very soul of Britain. It was the violation of the most sacred ground imaginable.
So for the Christian world, it didn't just feel like a crime. It felt like a cosmic horror.
Cosmic horror. That's exactly it.
It's the feeling of waking up and realizing gravity has stopped working. The fundamental unwritten laws that govern reality itself just broke.
Yeah.
And what's amazing about our historical records is that we actually have the voice of someone who experienced that exact psychological break, a guy named Alcuin of York.
Oh, Alcuin is such a crucial lens for this event.
Can you explain who he was? Because his reaction in the sources is just wild.
Yeah, he was a Northumbrian, so he was an Englishman born not far from Lindisfarne. But he was also arguably the leading intellectual and scholar of his entire generation.
A real heavyweight.
Oh, absolutely. At the time of the raid in 793, he wasn't actually in England. He was living at the court of Charlemagne.
Bringing the Franks.
Exactly. The most powerful ruler in Western Europe. The man who would soon revive the title of Holy Roman Emperor.
So Alcuin is sitting at the absolute epicenter of European wealth, power, and intellect. He's surrounded by the greatest minds, the most powerful armies in the world. And he gets a letter from home.
He gets the news. And his reaction is preserved in this series of agonizing letters he wrote back to the King of Northumbria and to the surviving Bishop of Lindisfarne.
I read some of those for this deep dive, and they are incredibly difficult to read, even now.
They really are. You can feel the absolute paralyzing disbelief in his words.
Yeah, the records quote him describing how the pagans desecrated God's sanctuary. He writes about the blood of the saints being spilled all around the altar and the bodies of holy men being, and this phrase really sticks with me, he says they were trampled like dung in the streets.
Just a brutal, visceral image.
Right. He says that never before had such a terror appeared in Britain, and that it was unthinkable that such an inroad from the sea could even be made. He literally couldn't comprehend how it physically happened.
It broke his understanding of the world.
It did. But what fascinated me when reading his letters was his explanation for why it happened, because he doesn't say, oh, the Norse have developed superior maritime technology.
No, of course not. You have to look at the mechanisms of the medieval mind. How did they process causality?
Right. Everything was spiritual.
Exactly. In their worldview, God was omnipotent. Nothing happened, absolutely nothing, unless God directly willed it or intentionally permitted it.
Okay.
So if the holiest place in the country, filled with the relics of saints and devoted servants of Christ, is violently destroyed by pagans who don't even believe in God.
Right. How does a brilliant theologian like Alcuin square that circle? If God is all-powerful, why didn't he strike the Vikings with lightning before they even hit the beach?
To Alcuin, the logic was terrifying but totally inevitable. God must have permitted the raid.
Wow.
And a just God would only permit such a horrific desecration if it were a punishment. Therefore, Alcuin concluded, this massacre was divine retribution for the sins of the English people.
So he blamed the victims?
Completely. But on a cosmic scale, he blamed the moral laxity of the English. He blamed corruption among the nobility, the vanity of the elite, the failures of the clergy to live pure lives.
So it was their own fault, in his eyes.
He basically said, we have angered God so deeply that he has summoned these pagan monsters from the sea to punish us. The Vikings weren't seen as independent political actors with their own motives.
They were just tools.
Right, they were viewed as the physical instruments of God's wrath.
It's a really tragic way to witness People trying to make sense of unimaginable trauma. They couldn't compute the idea of random, senseless violence against the divine order, so they had to invent a massive moral failing to justify the horror. They just needed it to make sense.
Yeah, human psychology demands an explanation.
Oh, and just as a quick aside, if you happen to have watched the TV show Vikings, you've actually seen this exact cultural collision dramatized. In the very first season, they use Lindisfarne as the pivotal opening act. They have the main character, Ragnar Lothbrok, leading his first voyage west, and they discover this rich, totally undefended monastery.
It's such a brilliant narrative choice of the show. I mean, even if they condense the historical timeline a bit to put Ragnar right there at the beginning, visually, it perfectly captures the total disconnect between these two realities.
It really does. You have these quiet, unsuspecting monks chanting in the candlelight, and then the raiders literally kick the heavy wooden doors in.
Yeah.
And the Vikings look around at all this incredible gold sitting right out in the open with literally 0 armed guards, and they're just like bewildered.
You think it's a trap at first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To them, it's just free treasure. And the show centers a lot of this emotional weight on the character of Athelstan, the monk who gets taken captive.
Right, he becomes the audience proxy in a way.
He does. He becomes this living, breathing bridge between the two cultures. The monks are screaming about sacrilege, and the Vikings are basically saying, if your god is so strong, why did he leave all his gold completely unguarded?
Which is such a perfect encapsulation, and it brings us to a fundamental shift in perspective that we have to talk about. If Alcuin and the Christians saw this as a divine punishment and an apocalyptic horror, what did the Norse see?
Right. What were they thinking?
Why, out of all the towns, all the forts, all the settlements in Europe were monasteries, the primary preferred targets of the early Viking Age.
See, this is where I want to push back a little in the traditional narrative, because it's so easy for us, sitting here with centuries of Christian cultural influence, to view attacking a monastery as an act of unique, deliberate evil. Like they were specifically trying to insult the religion. But the historical records show that to a pagan Norseman, a monastery wasn't a sacrilege at all. It was just a profoundly logical business opportunity.
Exactly. It was a cold, calculated economic decision.
Yeah.
The Vikings were, above all, pragmatists. And a monastery hit every single metric for a perfect target.
So what were those metrics?
Well, there were 4 undeniable factors that made places like Lindisfarne irresistible. Let's break down the brutal logic of it. The first factor, obviously, is wealth.
Staggering wealth. I think people underestimate just how rich these places were.
They really do. They were essentially the central banks of the early Middle Ages.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Over generations, kings, queens, and wealthy nobles had donated vast fortunes to these monasteries.
I'd give so much away.
To honor God, yes, but primarily to buy prayers for their souls. They deeply believed that having monks pray for them continually would smooth their path in the afterlife.
So it was like spiritual insurance.
Exactly. So the wealth just accumulated over decades and centuries. We are talking about massive, solid gold crosses, silver chalices, reliquaries.
Wait, what exactly is a reliquary?
It's an ornate container built specifically to hold the bones of saints. And these things were completely covered in emeralds and rubies, book covers encrusted with precious stones. It was an astonishing concentration of highly portable wealth.
Highly portable being the key phrase there. I mean, you don't have to melt down a cathedral. You just grab the jeweled goblet and run.
Right into the boat.
But factor number 2 is the one that really blows my mind. The defenses, or, well, the total lack of them.
The security system of a monastery was entirely theoretical. It was a shared religious taboo. The monks were men of peace. They were explicitly forbidden from shedding blood.
So they didn't even have swords.
None. And they didn't build defensive walls to keep armies out, because what Christian army would ever dare attack the shrine of St. Cuthbert? The sanctity of the location was supposed to be the armor.
But to a Norse pagan, that invisible armor didn't exist. It's like, imagine you were walking down the street and you see a massive bank vault. Millions of dollars in cash just sitting there on tables. The heavy steel doors are propped wide open. There are no security guards. There are no cameras. There are no alarms.
Robber's dream.
Exactly. And the only thing protecting the money is a little flimsy cardboard sign taped to the door that says, "Do not enter," written in a language you don't even know how to read. That is exactly what a monastery looks like to a Viking.
That is a perfect analogy. The Vikings looked at that setup and didn't see holiness. They saw extreme vulnerability. And that leads directly to the third factor, location. Where were these open bank vaults actually situated?
They were always out in the middle of nowhere, islands, coastal cliffs, isolated peninsulas.
Right, but why? The monks chose those spots deliberately for spiritual isolation. They wanted to remove themselves from the noise, the politics, and the corruption of the mainland. They sought the wilderness to be closer to God.
Which makes sense for a monk.
It does, but by placing themselves on tidal islands like Lindisfarne or remote rocky coasts, they unknowingly positioned themselves perfectly for an amphibious assault.
Oh, wow, yeah.
The Vikings could sail right up to the beach, strike the monastery, and be back out on the open ocean with the loot before the local English lord even received word that an attack was happening.
Because the response time for a medieval army was, what, weeks? And the Vikings were gone in hours.
Exactly.
And then there is the fourth factor, which is definitely the darkest part of this logic, human plunder. Because the raiders didn't just take the gold, the monks themselves were inventory.
Yes, the slave trade. It is impossible to understand the Viking Age without understanding the sheer scale of the Norse slave economy. Human beings were a massive commodity.
And monks were ideal targets for that.
Unfortunately, yes. Monks were literate. They are often highly skilled artisans. They were generally well-fed and healthy. And crucially, they were completely unarmed and compliant.
So no resistance.
Very little. They could be easily rounded up, thrown into the bottom of a ship, and integrated into a vast international trafficking network.
Where were they taking them? Because I know they didn't just keep them all in Scandinavia to farm.
Some were kept as thralls, which were forced laborers on Scandinavian farms. But many, many more were transported to massive trading hubs. Places like Hedeby in modern-day Germany, or later, Dublin in Ireland.
Wait, Dublin was a Viking slave market?
Dublin was basically founded by the Vikings as a massive slave market. From there, captives could be sold all the way down into the Mediterranean, to the Byzantine Empire, or into the Islamic world, where European slaves fetched enormous prices.
Oh, that is horrifying.
It was a huge industry. Alternatively, if a monk happened to be the younger son of a wealthy noble family, which was very common, lords sent their extra sons to monasteries, the Vikings would simply hold him for an astronomical ransom.
So you add up those four factors: extreme portable wealth, zero physical defenses, easy immediate access from the ocean, and a captive, unarmed population that you can sell or ransom.
It's the perfect storm.
The Vikings didn't hit Lindisfarne because they hated Jesus. They hit it because the risk-to-reward ratio was literally the best in the known world. It was a zero-risk, high-yield investment for them.
It was the discovery of a flawless formula. Lindisfarne proved that this strategy worked perfectly. And once that proof of concept was established, the escalation was absolutely inevitable.
Okay, but this raises a massive critical thinking question for me. A glaring historical mystery.
Right.
Scandinavia had been right there, across the North Sea, forever. The monks had been sitting on those English and Frankish coasts, hoarding gold and not building walls for centuries. They coexisted in the exact same geographic neighborhood for hundreds of years.
Sure.
So why 793? What actually changed? Why did the storm break on that exact date?
This is where history gets incredibly fascinating, because massive shifts never happen due to just one single factor. It's always a convergence.
Right, a domino effect.
Exactly. The historical records identify four major shifts: technological, societal, and political, that all happened to peak right around the end of the 8th century. Let's start with the most critical piece of the puzzle, the technology, the ship.
Right, the Viking longship. We all know the silhouette, but how did it actually work? Because before this, they were just hugging the coastlines, right?
Exactly. For centuries, Scandinavian boats were primarily rowed. They were effective for traveling up and down the fjords or moving along the coast, but you could not take them out into the violent deep waters of the North Sea safely.
You'd just capsize.
You'd be crushed. But by the late 700s, Scandinavian shipbuilders had perfected the open ocean sailing longship. They integrated a massive, highly effective square sail. But the real genius, the absolute game changer, was the mastery of the clinker-built hull.
I always hear that term clinker-built thrown around in history books. But what does that actually mean for the mechanics of the boat?
It's all about how the wood is manipulated. In most European ships at the time, the wooden planks of the hull were laid flush, edge to edge, making a solid, rigid wall.
Like a barrel.
Right. But in a clinker-built ship, the planks overlap each other, like the siding on a house. And here's the crucial detail. They didn't saw the wood.
They didn't saw it, then how did they shape it?
They took straight oak logs and split them with wedges along the natural grain. This made the planks incredibly strong, but surprisingly thin and light. They riveted these overlapping planks together with iron and packed the seams with tarred wool to make it waterproof.
Wait, so the hull wasn't rigid?
Not at all. It was deeply flexible. When a clinker-built ship hit a massive ocean wave, it didn't shatter against the water. The entire hull literally flexed and twisted, riding over the swell.
Oh, that makes so much sense. It's like how modern skyscrapers are engineered to sway slightly in the wind during a hurricane. If they were perfectly rigid, they would snap. The flexibility is the strength.
That is a phenomenal analogy, yes.
Yeah.
The flexibility allowed these ships to survive the brutal North Sea. But the clinker design also gave the ship a remarkably shallow draft, meaning the bottom of the boat didn't sink deep into the water.
How shallow are we talking?
A ship measuring 70 feet long, carrying 50 heavily armed warriors and tons of cargo, might only sit 3 feet deep in the water.
That is insane. 3 feet?
3 feet, which meant they could cross the deep ocean and then immediately transition to the shallowest environments. They could glide right up onto a sandy beach without needing a port. They could row hundreds of miles of shallow inland rivers right into the heart of Europe.
That is a terrifying capability.
It was. That combination deep seaworthiness and shallow water maneuverability was revolutionary. No one else in the world had anything like it.
So they finally have the vehicle, but what about the motivation? Because building a fleet of these longships requires massive resources. You need massive amounts of timber, iron for the rivets, vast fields of sheep just to weave the wool for one single sail.
It was a massive investment.
Why go through all that effort just to leave home?
That brings us to the second factor. Pressures at home.
You have to look at the geography of Scandinavia. It is breathtakingly beautiful, but it is harsh. It's mountainous, deeply cut by fjords, heavily forested. Good, arable farmland is actually quite scarce.
And by the late 8th century, the climate had warmed slightly and the population was booming. You suddenly have a lot of people competing for a very limited amount of usable land.
And the political situation is shifting too, right? I read that kings were starting to emerge.
Drastically. You have ambitious local chieftains who are starting to consolidate power. They are warring with their neighbors, centralizing authority, taking over the prime real estate.
So the little guy gets squeezed out.
Exactly. Imagine you are a young man in Norway or Denmark. You are the second or third son in your family. Under inheritance laws, the eldest son gets the farm. You get nothing.
Ouch.
And your local king is becoming increasingly tyrannical, taxing whatever you do have. You have no land, no wealth, and therefore no way to pay a bride price to get married and start a family.
So you are restless, ambitious, capable of violence, and totally disenfranchised.
Exactly. You have an entire generation of surplus men with limited prospects at home. They desperately need portable wealth to secure social status, to buy land, to gain independence. The pressure cooker was building, and the sea was calling.
Which perfectly sets up factor 3, knowledge. Because they didn't just jump in these new ships and sail blindly into the fog, hoping they bumped into an island covered in gold. They knew exactly where they were going.
They absolutely did. Before the Vikings were raiders, they were traders.
Right.
Scandinavians had been moving peacefully along the coasts of Britain and Francia for decades, trading furs, walrus ivory, and amber for glass, wine, and weapons. They were highly observant.
They were paying attention.
As they traded, they had eyes. They saw the wealthy monasteries. They noticed the lack of defensive walls. They saw the silver crosses sitting out in the open. The intelligence gathering had been happening completely out in the open for a generation.
So they were literally casing the joint while selling them furs.
Essentially, yes. They mapped the river systems. They noted the tidal patterns. They learned the political layout. And that political layout is the fourth and final piece of the puzzle, the state of the victims, the divided opponents.
Because if England or the Frankish Empire had been these unified, highly militarized coastal fortresses, maybe the Vikings would have just decided raiding was too risky and kept trading. But they weren't.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Let's look at England. There was no single king of England. It was a fragmented patchwork of rival kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and they were constantly fighting each other in brutal civil wars.
So they were distracted.
Highly distracted. And their military infrastructure was entirely land-focused. It was based on heavy infantry, ealdormen gathering their local farmers, marching slowly from one muddy field to another. They had absolutely no concept of naval defense. They didn't have standing navies patrolling the coasts.
Wait, I have to ask, if they were so wealthy, why didn't the kings just build coastal forts? Or why didn't the monasteries start building walls the minute they realized they were vulnerable?
It comes down to the mechanics of a pre-industrial economy. Building walls requires massive capital, skilled masonry, and decades of labor. But more importantly, A wall is useless without a standing garrison of professional soldiers to man it.
And they couldn't afford that.
Right. Maintaining a standing professional army requires a centralized taxation system and a massive agricultural surplus that these fragmented kingdoms simply did not have. A local king could raise an army for a few weeks in the summer, but he couldn't keep them stationed on the coast all year.
So they were fundamentally incapable of responding to hit-and-run tactics.
Precisely. If a Viking ship landed, raided a town, and left in 3 hours, a medieval king's army would take 3 weeks just to muster, supply themselves, and march to the spot.
Right.
By the time the English army arrived, the Vikings were already back in Norway spending the silver.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when you lay out that convergence, it is genuinely terrifying from a strategic standpoint. You have a massive, disenfranchised population of young, landless warriors desperate for wealth.
Yep.
You hand them a piece of brand new, cutting-edge technology that lets them travel hundreds of miles over open ocean and land silently on any beach in the world. You give them the exact intelligence of where the wealthiest, least defended targets are. And the police force of that world is basically riding tricycles.
Exactly.
It's an entirely new paradigm of warfare. It's the birth of amphibious asymmetric warfare.
And that, ultimately, is why the storm broke in 793. The fuse had been burning for decades across all these different societal factors, but Lindisfarne was the moment the bomb finally went off.
So the stage is completely set. The motivations are crystal clear. Let's go back to that specific day, because the way it was recorded by the victims is just dripping with atmosphere. The sources pull from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is this amazing year-by-year historical record kept by English monks.
It's an incredible document.
It really is. And the entry for the year 793 is incredibly dramatic. It doesn't just start with the ship's landing, it starts with cosmic warnings. They talk about dire portents.
Yes, the Chronicle states that in the months leading up to the raid, terrible signs appeared over Northumbria. It describes massive whirlwinds, immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons flying through the sky.
Fiery dragons in the sky? I mean, you read that and you have to wonder, what were they actually looking at?
Right. What was the natural phenomena?
Was it an unusually aggressive meteor shower? Was it a massive solar flare causing the aurora borealis to reach unusually far south? Or was it purely psychological? Like, looking back after the massacre, the traumatized survivors felt like the universe must have been warning them.
It's almost certainly retrospective storytelling, which is a very common feature in medieval chronicles. When a disaster of this magnitude happens, human psychology desperately wants to believe that nature itself was crying out in warning.
Right. It makes it feel less random.
Exactly. It's a way of imposing order on chaos. If the sky warned us, then it wasn't completely random. But the Chronicle quickly moves from the supernatural omens to the very grim, physical reality. It states bluntly that the harrying of the heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter.
The swiftness of the violence is what gets me. You imagine a monk working meticulously on a manuscript, looking out the window at the ocean. Maybe he thinks it's a Frankish trading ship.
Completely normal sight.
Yeah. And then, mere minutes later, a man with an iron axe kicks the door off its hinges. We're talking about men murdered right at the altar. Survivors stripped naked, humiliated, whipped out of their home, or shackled neck to neck to be sold. All of it over in a few hours. The absolute chaos of it.
It was a surgical strike of sheer terror. But amidst all that darkness and destruction, our historical records do point out a few miraculous survivals. Silver linings that really matter to the broader scope of history.
Yeah, this part is fascinating. Because they didn't lose everything. The body of St. Cuthbert, the holiest, most valuable relic they possessed, somehow survived the raid.
Which is amazing.
It is. The monks managed to hide it, or the Vikings simply didn't care about a wooden box full of old bones when there was solid gold to carry. And miraculously, the Lindisfarne Gospels survived as well. But the aftermath for the monks who lived through it wasn't just a matter of cleaning up the blood and going back to their normal routines. It became a generational tragedy.
The survivors didn't immediately abandon the island. They tried to rebuild. But the illusion of safety was permanently gone. As the Viking Age escalated over the coming decades, Lindisfarne became increasingly untenable.
They were basically a sitting duck.
Exactly. It was a known target on the Norse maps. Finally, the community made the agonizing decision to leave their holy island forever.
And they took St. Cuthbert with them.
They did. And this paints such a haunting image of the era. For generations, this community of monks essentially became refugees in their own country.
Wow, generations.
They wandered the rugged landscape of the north of England, physically carrying the heavy wooden coffin of St. Cuthbert, constantly looking for a safe place to rest. They were a community in perpetual exile.
That's heartbreaking.
It took them nearly a century to finally settle in a highly defensible rocky bend in the river at Durham, where they built the great cathedral that still houses Cuthbert today. But think about the psychological weight of that reality. The Vikings were a threat so terrifying, so pervasive, that even the dead saints had to flee.
That is a staggering image. Dead saints fleeing the Vikings. A
Yeah.
century of wandering. It really emphasizes that Lindisfarne wasn't just a bank robbery. It was the systematic destruction of an entire civilization, a very specific way of life.
To fully grasp the magnitude of the tragedy, we have to look at what historians call the Golden Age of Northumbria. The world that the Vikings attacked wasn't a dark, backward, ignorant corner of the world. It was a luminous, internationally recognized center of culture and learning.
Right. I mean, Jarrow was right down the coast, which was the home of the Venerable Bede.
Yeah.
He's the scholar who basically invented the concept of English history. His writings are foundational to our understanding of the era. The monasteries back then weren't just places where guys in hoods sat in miserable silence.
Far from it.
They were the universities of the medieval world. They were the libraries. They were the premier art studios. Monks were preserving ancient Greek and Roman texts. They were studying astronomy. They were mapping the stars. They were creating breathtaking art.
And the Lindisfarne Gospels are the ultimate physical proof of that brilliance, created around the year 700, so almost a century before the raid.
I have to geek out about this book for a second because it is unbelievable. If you look up pictures of the Lindisfarne Gospels, your jaw will drop. We are talking about a sublime, flawless fusion of Celtic knotwork, those impossibly complex, interwoven geometric designs combined with Anglo-Saxon animal motifs and Mediterranean Christian imagery.
It's mesmerizing.
They have these things called carpet pages, which are entire pages completely covered in mathematical patterns that look like woven oriental rugs.
Yes, and consider the materials and the labor involved. The pages were made of vellum, which is specially prepared calfskin. It required the skins of hundreds of animals just to make the pages for this one book. The inks were made from local plants, but also from incredibly rare materials traded from across the known world, like lapis lazuli, brought all the way from the mountains of Afghanistan.
Wait, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to an island in England?
In the year 700, yes. And the records suggest this was likely the work of a single, brilliant, patient monk, a man named Edfrith, laboring over this parchment day after day for years, maybe a decade. It was an act of supreme devotion.
It is the absolute pinnacle of slow, deliberate, peaceful creation. And it requires an environment of absolute, unquestionable security to produce something like that. You cannot paint microscopic, intricate carpet pages if you're constantly looking over your shoulder waiting for an axe to fall.
Exactly. And that is the contrast that historians find so heartbreaking. You have this painstaking, luminous devotion on one side, and on the other, the swift, brutal utility of men who just want to pry the jewels off the leather cover and melt the gold cross down into currency.
They didn't care about the art.
They didn't care about the decades of labor or the Afghan lapis lazuli. They just wanted the bullion.
And unfortunately, the utter success at Lindisfarne meant that this destruction was going to spread rapidly. The formula worked too well. The terror metastasized almost immediately across the map.
It behaved exactly like a contagion. The next year, 794, the dragon ships hit monasteries further north at Jarrow. By 795, they reach Iona.
Oh man, Iona.
And if you know anything about Celtic Christianity, Iona is basically their Vatican. It is the supremely holy island off the west coast of Scotland, founded by St. Columba. And the Vikings hit it, repeatedly.
They just kept coming back.
Over the next decade, there was a notorious attack where they slaughtered a huge number of monks at a bay on the island that was remembered ever after as the Bay of Martyrs. Then they started hitting the coasts of Ireland.
The dragon ships were suddenly everywhere. The western seaways, which for centuries had been peaceful highways of trade, of monks traveling to share books, of religious pilgrimage, instantly became zones of terror. No coastal community could sleep soundly.
The paranoia must have been suffocating.
Every time they looked at the horizon, they wondered if a square sail was going to appear. This era gave rise to a famous phrase, a prayer that is deeply associated with this period of psychological dread. It goes, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us."
From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. It completely captures the mood of an entire continent, waking up to the realization that the ocean is no longer a protective moat. The ocean is now the enemy's highway. There was nowhere left to hide.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to step back and look at the dual meaning of this collision. Because it's very easy to look at the Viking Age through rose-colored glasses today. Pop culture loves the mythology, the rugged aesthetic, the exploration, the idea of these fearless warriors taking on the world.
Very romanticized.
Very much so. And from the Norse perspective, this age was about glory. It was an explosion of adventure, of pushing past the horizon, of young, disenfranchised men going out and seeking their fortune, fundamentally reshaping the map of Europe in the process.
That's entirely true. The Viking expansion is undeniably one of the most incredible feats of human endurance, maritime engineering, and navigation in world history.
Right.
But Lindisfarne demands that we remember the other perspective. An honest reading of history requires us to hold two opposing truths at once. To the victims on those beaches, the Vikings were not heroes.
Yeah.
They were not brave explorers.
Not at all.
They were an apocalyptic scourge. They were mass enslavers. They were murderers who violently destroyed the most beautiful, peaceful, and sacred things in their world.
The glory and the terror. You cannot separate them. They are two sides of the exact same coin. And the historical sources leave us with a final, really provocative thought to mull over. A lesson that feels incredibly relevant even today. The tragedy of Lindisfarne teaches a brutal, timeless lesson about the fragility of human agreements. The monks of Lindisfarne lived in peace. They lived with total gentleness. They operated under the assumption that everyone shared the same rules and respected the same boundaries. But that gentleness offered them absolute zero protection.
If anything, it made them a target.
Exactly. The Vikings looked at their trust, their lack of walls, their peacefulness, and saw it purely as a vulnerability to be brutally exploited. It makes you wonder, where else in history, or even in our own modern, everyday lives, do we rely entirely on unwritten social taboos for our safety? What happens when someone walks into the room who simply doesn't share your worldview and hasn't agreed to your rules?
It's a chilling question. When the social contract is broken by someone who never signed it in the first place, the people relying on that contract are always the most vulnerable.
It is a dark thought to end on, but it is absolutely necessary to understand the true birth of the Viking Age. The storm had broken over Lindisfarne, the world had changed in a single morning, and it was only going to get worse. Next deep dive, we follow this storm as it grows. We are moving beyond the hit-and-run raiding of isolated islands and undefended monks. The Vikings are about to get much more ambitious and far more frightening. They aren't just coming for the churches anymore. Next episode, Ivar the Boneless.
The stakes get much, much higher.
They certainly do. Thank you for joining us today and for standing with us on the bloodied shores of the Holy Island. Until next time.